environmental objectives and planning to achieve them. Hello friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to discuss the clause 6.2 of ISO 14001-2015, which deals with the environmental objectives and planning to achieve them. Let us explain you. Coverage in the standard. Under this chapter, we have covered the requirements of clause 6.2 of ISO 14001-2015, including their subclauses, that is, clause 6.2.1, clause 6.2.2, which deals with the establishment of environmental objectives and planning to achieve the same. Reference clause within standards or the other standards, which can be useful to understand the clause 6.2 along with their subclauses, that is 6.2.1 and 6.2.2, we have to refer clause 3.2.5 and clause 3.2.6, which defines the relevant terms used in this chapter. It will be useful reference to understand the requirements of this clause. External reference for the chapter. Under external references, family standards, that is ISO 14004-2016, ISO 14005-2019, ISO 19011-2018, and requirements of ISO 17021-1 can be useful material to understand this chapter. Outcome of the chapter. This course will provide you with the knowledge and skills required to perform audit and or verification of implementation of the clause 6.2 with subclauses 6.2.1 and 6.2.2. You will be guided through processes in relation to requirements of clause 6.2 with subclauses 6.2.1 and 6.2.2. And over the successful completion of training of this chapter, you will gain the knowledge and skills required to undertake and lead a successful EMS audit under this clause. Further, this chapter covers environmental objectives, planning actions. Brief introduction of clause 6.2. Clause 6.2 of ISO 14001-2015 describes the environmental objectives and plannings to achieve the same. By definition, an objective is a thing or goal which is supposed to be achieved within a specified timeline. In ISO 14001-2015, environmental objectives are goals which to be achieved in future. In reference to ISO 14001-2015, we can explain it that the objectives are documents and targets are records, means that objectives, documents can be changed, but you cannot change your targets. In setting the objectives and targets, you have to be realistic and reasonable. This must be communicated to your employees from top to bottom, and their involvement must be clearly defined at all levels. This clause is further split into two subclauses, that is, clause 6.2.1, environmental objectives, clause 6.2.2, planning actions to achieve environmental objectives. Let us understand the environmental objectives and environmental targets as defined under clause 6.2.1 through some good examples. Reduce the generation of hazardous waste. Minimize the use of raw materials. Minimum releases of air pollution contaminants to the environment. Compliance with all environmental laws as applicable. Maximum use of recycled products where feasible. Restriction on the purchasing of chemical substances that promotes. Restriction on the purchasing of chemicals substance that promotes carcinogenesis. Protection of environment for future generations. Examples: environmental targets. Reduction of generation of hazardous waste by 25% within 12 months. Reduction of sanitary waste from operations by 20% within next financial year 2020-2021. Recycle 50% plastic waste from all operations by 2022 and 60% by 2023. Now, let us understand the clause 6.2.2, which address the planning action to achieve the environmental objectives as set out in clause 6.2.1. Planning action means a detailed plan. Alternatively, it can be defined as a sequence of steps that must be taken or activities that must be performed well for a strategy. In reference to ISO 14001 2015, an action plan must be developed that defines the how the environmental objectives will be achieved. This planning action includes the following: 1. What will be done? Second, what resources will be required? Third, who will be responsible? Fourth, when it will be completed? 5. How the results will be evaluated, including indicators for monitoring progress toward achievement. Image 1 is also attached to have better understand of the same. Requirement of the clause of the standard 6.2 environmental objectives and planning to achieve them. 6.2.1 Environmental objectives. The organization shall establish environmental objectives at relevant functions and levels, taking into account the organization's significant environmental aspects and associated compliance obligations, and considering its risks and opportunities. The environmental objectives shall be: A. Consistent with the environmental policy. B. Measurable, if it is practicable. C. Monitored. D. Communicated. E. Updated as appropriate. The organization shall maintain documented information on the environmental objectives. 6.2.2 Planning actions to achieve environmental objectives. When planning how to achieve its environmental objectives, the organization shall determine: A. What will be done? B. What resources will be required? C. Who will be responsible? D. When it will be completed? E. How the results will be evaluated, including indicators for monitoring progress towards achievement of its measurable environmental objectives. C. 9.1.1 The organization shall consider how actions to achieve its environmental objectives can be integrated into the organization's business processes. Mandatory documents and retention of documents. Under clause 6.2, the organization has to maintain one mandatory document as below: environmental objectives and plans for achieving them. Clause 6.2. Some additional factor. Under this section, participants will learn how environmental objectives can work best. In ISO 14001 2015, environmental objectives and targets are to be achieved through a defined planning, which will include the defined course of action that: first, what will be done; second, what resources will be required; 3. Who will be responsible; 4. When it will be completed; 5. How the results will be evaluated. Defining an action plan for each objective will require the efforts of the personnel at different levels, and it would be coordinated efforts, and each personal responsibility must be defined. A team leader will be responsible for each objective, and he must know the timelines to achieve the targets as assigned. The auditor will verify that the record evidence that effective planning was done to achieve the organization's objective, and he shall also ensure that this planning was as per the requirements of the clause 6.2.2. Practice writing non-conformity under this clause. Sample NC1 is given in the reference documents to understand the non-conformity writing through a defined format, which is named as AFAR, Audit Findings Action Report. Last but not least, now let us understand the common mistakes auditors do while auditing clause 6.2 of ISO 14001:2015. A. Auditors ask irrelevant questions for the organization which does not relate with the organizations to be audited. B. Sometimes auditors start thinking for the option, while auditors need to understand the client process and to decide if the client can achieve the result of the MSS through their own process. C. Auditors start consulting activities. D. Auditors start expecting document and records in clause where this may not be mandatory requirement. E. Auditors asking for FSSAI license and registration, asking for the GST registration, asking for the ROC registration, asking for the commencement of the business certificate, asking of PF and ESI registration certificate. Dear friends, we have now come to the conclusion of this training session. See you soon with an exciting new topic. Till then, goodbye.